All right, so with chapter 3, we're continuing our look at the origins of criminal behavior. With chapter 3, we're focusing on biological factors. A lot of people get uncomfortable when we talk about biological factors in criminal behavior because we're suggesting that somebody's biology is causing them to commit criminal behavior and they should therefore be excused of that behavior. And that's not what we're saying here. Again, remember, we're attempting to understand and explain criminal behavior. So biology is incredibly interesting and a really innovative area of research. A lot of great, interesting information here in this chapter. So many criminologists and psychologists believe that there are biological and or neurological abnormalities or deficits related to antisocial behavior and criminal behavior, especially with those early onset behaviors that we have been talking about. While late set offending appears to be more influenced by social factors. So when we find early onset, remember that was like before age 10, we find really strong connections with biology. And then if offending starts later in life, it's usually more of a social influence, maybe a social learning theory, poverty, things like that. Behavioral genetics is the field that looks at the role genes play in the formation and development of human and or animal behavior. So it's a branch of biology that looks at the relationship between genes and the environment. Traditional behavioral genetics use twin, sibling, and even adoptive studies to determine, number one, how much of behavior is related to genes. Number two, how much is the environment responsible, and how much do shared or unshared experiences play a role with that. Shared means, for example, if you have identical twins that grew up in the same house, that would be a shared environment. If you have identical twins that grew up in different houses, that would be unshared experiences or unshared environments. Molecular genetics looks at which specific genes are responsible for which specific behaviors. So that's really studying the actual genes at the molecular level to determine how much of a gene or which specific gene is responsible for which types of behaviors. So with behavioral genetics, we're looking at the influences of genes on behavior. And it also allows us to kind of look at the, again, shared environments that siblings usually is how it's done, shared or unshared experiences. So by looking at particularly identical twins that grew up in the same house and those who grew up in different houses, we can determine how much of biology is responsible for behavior and how much of environment. So by comparing fraternal twins to identical twins, we can get a better idea of the roles that both genes and environments play on things like IQ, personality, and even behavior. Over 100 studies with 800,000 pairs of twins have been done. From these, we know that about 50% of the variation in antisocial behavior in the population is influenced by genes, suggesting genes play a significant role in behavior. Similar findings have been found for behaviors like aggression, violent behaviors, and serious juvenile offending. It's important to remember that genes do not directly cause behavior. Genes are not fixed or static. They are influenced by the environment. But people can be born with a genetic predisposition for a certain trait or certain behavior, and the environment will influence how or if those genes will be expressed. Think of it like a light switch. So you can be born with a genetic predisposition for, let's say, high levels of aggression. But if you are raised in an environment that is not aggressive, that's loving and caring, and aggression is not taught or valued, that gene expression, it won't get switched on. That light switch won't get switched on. But if you're born with that genetic predisposition and you grow up in a violent household or a violent neighborhood, it's more likely that influence, that switch will be turned on and that trait will be displayed. So again, we study all kinds of relationships, really, but twins are probably the best form of research, or the best population for research. Fraternal twins, also called dizygotic twins, are two separate eggs. So two separate eggs are fertilized at the same time. So these siblings don't share any more than regular siblings that are born on different years. So they typically share about 50% of the same DNA. Now, identical twins, also called monozygotic twins, this is when one egg splits in half. So they are genetically identical. And so this really gives us a lot of information on the role that genes play. There is a link under Chapter 3. There is a link under Chapter 3 in D2L to a video called the Gym Twins, and it really is an interesting video on the role that genes play on things that we might not have understood they play on in terms of our likes or dislikes, our preferences, things like that. So super interesting. Make sure that you watch that video. I talked about shared and non-shared environments. That just means shared environments means you grew up in the same house or you shared some of the same social environments during childhood. Non-shared is typically twins or siblings that were raised in different households, so maybe through adoption or divorce or something like that. Concordance is the degree to which related pairs of subjects both show a particular behavior or condition. That Gym Twins video has a lot of that in it, so make sure you watch that. When it comes to criminal behavior, there's been a lot of interesting studies on concordance. So first of all, if we looked at 20 sets of identical twins and found that 10 had similar IQs, concordance rate would be 50%, by the way. A study done in 1929 by Lane found a concordance rate of 77% for identical twins and only 12% for fraternal twins when it came to criminal behavior. Another study that was done in 1932 by LaGrasse found a concordance rate of 100%, but it was only for 5 sets of identical twins. That's actually a small subject, a small population, so we have to kind of keep that in mind. More recent research have used larger sample sizes and better statistical methods than some of those earlier studies done in the 20s and 30s, but they continue to get pretty high rates for identical twins, considering there's a strong genetic influence with criminal behavior. The twins early development study, this is a study that has tons of twins in it. And it found behaviors and developments in language, cognition, and academic abilities from early childhood through adolescence. Those are some of the things that they are looking at. The TED, by the way, this study is called the TED study, TEDS. So they found so far that, and by the way, this is a longitudinal study that started, it's looking at 13,000 pairs of twins in King's College London. So it's one of the largest sample sizes of twins, and they're looking at twins born in 1994, 95, and 96. The study looks at behavior problems as well as developmental issues, language, cognition, academics, as it talks about there. Some of the things that the TEDS data have suggested so far, behavior issues like those associated with ADHD suggest nature has a considerable influence. So that's biology. Remember, nature versus nurture. Nature is biology, nurture is your environment. Antisocial behavior. Heritability plays a modest role, but one trait associated with antisocial behavior, callous, unemotional trait. And that's very much like what we were talking about previously with antisocial personality disorder, where lack of empathy, lack of sympathy, inability to feel guilt, remorse, and shame. So this particular trait showed high heritability with very little environmental influence, so suggesting that this callousness is genetic. Findings support the general consensus of environmental influences turn genetic influences on and off. Remember that switch I was talking about? Social environment, especially parent and family, affect those who are genetically at risk more than previously thought. So these studies have really found lots of genetic connections with problematic behaviors, and does support that kind of idea that you can be born with a genetic predisposition and your early environment is either going to flip that switch on or leave it off. The twins early development study. This is a longitudinal study. I'm sorry, this is the same TED study, but again, it found support for biology in aggressive behavior in children. Adoption studies, there's been a lot of different adoption studies as well. The one in 1972 was 57 adopted adults diagnosed as psychopaths were compared to 57 non-psychopaths. They were matched on sex, age, social class, found 3.9% of the biological relatives of psychopaths adoptees could also be classified as psychopaths compared to only 1.4% of the control group, suggesting that psychopathy has a genetic connection. The Crow study in 1974, 52 people put up for adoption with criminal mothers were compared to a control group of 52 adoptees with no biological family history of crime. The experimental group had arrest records that were almost 3 times higher than the control group. Again, remember the experimental group had a biological family history of criminal behavior. The control group did not, and they did find that the experimental group with that biological history of criminal behavior was almost 3 times more likely to engage in criminal behavior themselves. Again, and just another study that supported the concept that genetics play a role in some aspects of criminal behavior. Hutchinson and Mendick in 1975, 1,100 male adoptees from Copenhagen, ages between 30 and 44 were matched with the same number of non-adoptees. 16.2% of the adoptees had a criminal record. 8.9% of the non-adoptees did. It revealed 3 times more likely to be involved in criminal behavior if you had a biological family member from your biological family, not your adoptive family. Again, more support that biology plays a role in criminal behavior. And then this last one was the most comprehensive study to date, compared court convictions of 14,000 adoptees in a small European country with conviction records of their biological and adoptive parents. They found a significant relationship between conviction history of adoptees and their biological parents for both males and females. So it was very strong for male adoptees, but also for females, just not quite as strong. So both twin and adoptive studies suggest genetic component may contribute, at least moderately, to a tendency to become criminals. Some people may be born with a biological predisposition, as we previously mentioned, and the early environment kind of flips that switch on, making some people more susceptible or more sensitive to negative environments during early childhood. All right, so as you remember, I said that molecular genetics is looking at specific genes. So there's a couple of interesting studies that have been done on specific genes. There's something called the MAOA-L gene, and it appears to play a significant role in preventing antisocial behavior. Low activity with this particular gene, meaning somebody is low in this particular gene, is linked to aggressive and violence, which is why it is nicknamed the warrior gene. So people that are have low activity with this gene tend to have higher levels of aggressive behavior and even violent behavior. It's estimated that at least a third of the population is low with this gene. One study showed that those who were exposed to adversity in childhood who have this low gene were significantly more likely to report offending in adolescence and adulthood, again, suggesting that this gene, being low with this particular gene, is a genetic predisposition. And then if you're exposed to adversity during childhood, it kind of switches this on. 7 genes have been identified by molecular genetic research to be associated with antisocial behavior in humans. In most cases, these genes contribute to impairments in brain structure and function, resulting in antisocial or abnormally aggressive behavior. All right. The dynamic interactions between behavior and the automatic nervous system. Involuntary functions such as heartbeat, blood pressure, breathing, and digestion are regulated by your autonomic nervous system. The amygdala is a little part of the brain, a little part deep inside the limbic system of the brain, which the limbic system is often referred to as the emotional part of the brain. The amygdala is important for regulating fear and other emotional responses related, kind of negative emotional responses. So the amygdala regulates a lot of our negative emotional responses. And it is hypothesized that those with psychopathic behavioral patterns and who are high in that callous unemotional trait, that their amygdala is not functioning properly. There's also been studies with the amygdala related to violent behavior. What I wanted to tell you guys about was let me just pull this over. All right, sorry about that. Here we go. All right, so there was a shooting in 1966 at the University of Texas. It's called the Texas Clock Tower shooting. The perpetrator was a man named Charles Whitman. And this is just a little information. You can Google this. Anyway, when they did the autopsy on Whitman, they found that he had a tumor in his brain that was leaning on his amygdala and impeding communication from the amygdala to other parts of the brain. And it's not an excuse for his behavior, but it suggested that this tumor was affecting the functioning of his amygdala, and that was contributing to his aggressive and violent behavior in the days, weeks, and months leading up to this particular incident. All right, temperament. Temperament is a kind of general disposition that babies are born with. And it's highly genetic. So babies can be born with an easy temperament, a slow to warm up temperament, or a difficult temperament. It's kind of an innate readiness to respond to the environment and to people around it. There are 3 different types of temperament that have been identified by developmental psychologists: easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. Difficult children represent a specific cluster of inborn temperamental attributes that make parenting challenging. And a lot of studies have found that babies with a difficult temperament often have problems with attachment. Remember, we talked about how important attachment is between the baby and its primary caregiver during the first couple of years of life. So babies with a difficult temperament often have attachment issues because parents have trouble attaching to those children. When we're looking at easy, difficult, or slow to warm up, these temperaments, babies are not born with a personality, but they are born with a temperament. And temperament seems to be the building blocks upon which personality will later be built. So a difficult temperament tends to turn into a personality that has difficult aspects of it. An easy temperament tends to turn into a personality that's pretty easygoing. It also is related to relationships later on. Difficult temperaments tend to have trouble creating social bonds with other people, and probably leads to that peer rejection that we talked about. Some of the factors that we look at when we talk about temperament is the rhythmic nature of the baby, meaning Um, do they have regular eating and sleeping habits? Activity level, approach to new stimuli, adaptability, sensory thresholds, predominant quality of mood, intensity of mood, distractibility, and attention span persistence. Babies with difficult temperaments, and these are again the ones that we worry about. They do not have regular sleeping or eating patterns for a pretty long time. They are super sensitive to environmental stimuli, noise, light, things like that. They cry a lot. All babies cry, but these are like babies that cry a lot for no particular reason, not because they're hungry or wet or tired. And they tend to be, just a difficult overall mood all the time. So these are the things that I was just talking about that we look at. So with an easy child, they get on a pretty regular schedule quickly. They have a good mood. They like, or they're not afraid of being held by other people. They adapt to new situations, and the intensity of their emotions is pretty low. They can still cry. All babies cry, but they're easily soothed. Slow to warm up. They also get on a regular schedule. Their moods tend to be a little negative. They do not like other people. They are slow to warm up to new situations. They tend to be really sensitive to environmental stimuli, but they have low intensity of those moods and are easily soothed. These are the ones that we worry about, the difficult children. Again, they don't get on regular eating or sleeping patterns, negative moods, do not like new people, are slow to adapt to new situations, and high intensity with those moods. As I mentioned, temperament is highly genetic. And it appears to continue throughout a life, or out one's life. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a baby with a difficult temperament, they tend to become children with difficult personalities. Now, it is highly genetic, but it is definitely influenced by the environment, which can be good and bad. So you can have a baby that's born with a genetic predisposition to have a difficult temperament, but if you have really caring and soothing and patient parents, you can kind of switch that temperament, or kind of ease that temperament over a little bit. But the opposite is, which is good, but the opposite is also true. You can have a baby that's born with an easy temperament, but if you have parents who are really stressed, who have mental health issues, depressed, high anxiety, you can actually move that baby's easy temperament over to difficult. So it is influenced by the environment. I mentioned when I was talking about developmental psychology that developmental psychologists look at all the things that children are exposed to from conception to death. Well, developmental psychology looks from conception to death. We now know that exposure while the baby is in vitro is incredibly important. So exposure in vitro, which just means while the baby is in their mom's tummy, may play a role in predisposition towards criminal behavior. I know that's really shocking, but fetuses exposed to opiates, methadone, alcohol, marijuana, and cigarettes are at higher risk for conduct disorder. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a spectrum disorder linked to self-regulation problems, antisocial behavior, conduct disorders. Exposure to lead before and after birth has been linked to academic and cognitive problems. Exposure to any type of neurotoxin during the pregnancy has been related to neurocognitive dysfunctions, meaning the brain is negatively impacted. The brain is developing all through the pregnancy. When we look at the 9 months of a pregnancy, at a certain particular time, the heart is being developed. At a certain particular time, the lungs are being developed. At a certain particular time, the hands are being developed. The brain is being developed during the entire pregnancy. So exposure to any type of neurotoxin at any time during the pregnancy and even after birth, because the brain continues to develop after birth, can negatively impact the brain. And that can lead to cognitive dysfunction and behavioral problems, and that has been related to antisocial behavior and even violence in adults. Some of the neurotoxins that we look at, I talked about lead, but cadmium, magnesium, mercury, and fish. any type of drug, alcohol, cigarettes, cleaning supplies, anything that a mom's exposed to has the ability to cross the placenta and affect the developing fetus. So anything in her environment has the potential to reach the baby. Prenatal and postnatal malnutrition. Remember, I said that the brain is developing all during the pregnancy and even after birth. When babies are born, their brain is only 25% of the size of an adult brain. So brain development continues the first couple of years after life. So any type of malnutrition is going to negatively impact brain development, and that could potentially lead to problems with behavior. I talked about exposure to alcohol, nicotine, slower brain development, and that can include secondhand smoke. There's been some studies. A link was found between smoking and antisocial behavior in boys, and that was a pretty strong connection, and it was a weak connection for girls. A study done in 1999 of 4,000 males found a strong connection between adult violent offending and smoking during pregnancy. Smoking may contribute to brain deficits that contribute to antisocial behavior. Moms that smoke during pregnancy tend to have less education, lower income, lower socioeconomic status, and that may lead to other risk factors that are contributing to some of these behavioral problems that we see. As well as lack of prenatal care and exposure to other teratogens, anything that can cross the placenta and affect a developing fetus is called a teratogen. And so women that smoke are likely to have other risk factors as well, meaning that other substances can cross the placenta and affect the developing fetus, and they're probably not getting the prenatal care that they need. Drug use. Any drug, whether it is recreational or even over-the-counter drugs, have the ability to cross the placenta and affect a developing fetus. Polydrug users just means that people that use one drug, when we're talking about recreational drugs here, tend to use more than one type of drug. So heroin users, for example, when they can't get their hands on heroin, they might turn to meth, or they might take pills or something like that. So we do tend to see polydrug use. So, and babies can be born addicted. I'm sure you guys have all heard of that. All right, traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is interesting because we don't often know that people have traumatic brain injury because there's no outside indication that the brain has been damaged. Particularly, we've seen this a lot with war vets who are close to IUDs going off, and they don't have any outside symptoms, but then their behavior becomes very changes, and it turns out that they actually have this traumatic brain injury. So it can lead to traumatic brain injury from an accident, from being close to an IED, from head injuries, from playing professional sports, has been linked to antisocial and serious criminal behavior, violence. 60%, some estimates suggest that 60% of incarcerated populations have had a brain injury at some point in their life. If you've ever listened to podcasts or studied serial killers, you'll probably hear that a lot of serial killers actually had concussions during childhood or some type of accident where they had a brain injury. Phineas Gage, there's a link in the information for Chapter 3 on Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who, in the late 1800s, who had a pipe go through his frontal lobes, and he lived, and that was kind of unheard of at this time. And before the accident, Phineas was kind of really a chill, nice guy, regular emotional responses. He was a foreman at his work, so he was very responsible. After the accident, his personality completely changed. He became aggressive, violent, verbally aggressive, started cussing a lot. His behavior just became very aggressive, had abnormal emotional responses. And it was really the first case in psychology that let us understand that the frontal lobes are involved in personality and also in self-regulation, things like that. I already talked about war veterans and professional athletes. If you have not heard of the Aaron Hernandez case, he is a professional football player who um, who engaged in violent behavior towards others with homicides. And he ended up committing suicide, and he was very young, by the way. And when they did an autopsy on his brain, they found that his brain, he had traumatic brain injury that was the worst case that they had ever seen in a professional athlete. There's a great and by the way, it was from repeated concussions playing football. There's a great podcast called Gladiator, and there's also a documentary on his case as well. So if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's really interesting, particularly as it talks about violent behavior and these repeated blows to the brain. So super interesting. I will post a link to information on Aaron Hernandez in chapter 3 for you to look at. Brain development abnormalities. I talked about the limbic system and the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala, it sits deep inside the brain in that emotional seat, and it regulates the brain. So it's clear that faulty brain development is related to serious and even violent behavior. This appears to be especially true for pathological violence. And this is especially true if the dysfunction is located in the frontal lobes, which are involved with self-control, planning, self-regulation, and even personality. I talked about the Phineas Gage case, so make sure you take a look at that. Damage from trauma can create issues, but brain development during prenatal development can as well, if there are negative things impacting brain development, like we talked about teratogens or even malnutrition. Cell development can be compromised due to viral infection, drugs, alcohol, exposure to any of those toxins that we talked about, malnutrition, and exposure to other teratogens. Remember, teratogens are anything that can cross the placenta and affect a developing fetus. Developmental issues related to the amygdala can result in issues with emotional responses, especially anger, like that Charles Whitman case that I was telling you guys about, who had the tumor that was leaning on his amygdala. After birth, brain development continues, as I mentioned earlier. Both the structure and function of the brain is changed by experience, and this is called plasticity. Nurturing sensitive care is one of the most important early experiences. The first 3 to 4 years seems to be critical time for many things, including prevention of antisocial behavior. So during early childhood, the brain is plastic. That's what brain plasticity means. It is able to change and adapt. The older we get, the less plasticity we have. So children that have brain damage from like a car accident or something like that, their brains are able to adapt, and other parts of the brain can take over. The older we get, the less able our brains are able to do that. Our brains become less plastic, so to speak, as we age. All right, hormones and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers of the brain. That's how neurons communicate to each other. A lot of research on the role neurotransmitters play in mental health issues in psychology. Research consistently shows that serotonin plays a role in aggression and violence. Serotonin and dopamine, by the way, are the feel-good neurotransmitters. So deficits with serotonin and dopamine are responsible for things like depression, but could also be related to aggression and violence behavior. Serotonin exists in large quantities in the frontal lobes normally. Deficiencies could be related to having higher levels of aggression. Testosterone is a hormone that has been studied. It is the male hormone, as most of you know. Men naturally have more testosterone than women. Women do have testosterone, it's just really low. So there's been a lot of studies that suggest that having abnormally high levels of testosterone could be related to aggression and violence. It's not a cause because there are plenty of men that have abnormally high levels of testosterone that are not aggressive, and there are men who have low levels of testosterone who are aggressive. So it could be one factor among many that is related to violent or aggressive behavior. Links between hormones and violence is still speculative and needs to be investigated further. There's also some interesting research out there on the Y chromosome. Females have two X chromosomes, males have one X and one Y. They discovered years ago that there are a certain number of men in the population that have an extra Y chromosome. So there was a lot of research for a while on the idea that having this extra Y chromosome made men more aggressive. That research has kind of fallen by the wayside, but it's still really interesting. I mentioned that dopamine and serotonin are both those feel-good neurotransmitters, but it's kind of research kind of suggests that low levels of both of those affects the frontal lobes in particular, and that's that self-control and lowering your inhibitions. GABA is another one, GABA, that is involved with inhibitions, and having not the appropriate amount of GABA could be related to self-control and inhibitions. All right, I talked about the frontal lobes, and I mentioned that they're often called the executive seat of the brain. And if the frontal lobes, and again, they're kind of the higher order processes that make us uniquely human. They organize, allow us to organize and plan our behavior, including reasoning, logic, abstract thought, self-control. I mentioned to you that the frontal lobes do not mature. It's the last part of the brain to mature, and they don't mature until we're about 25. There are a lot of studies that have been done that should show a significant relationship between deficits in executive functioning in antisocial behavior in children and adolescents. That's not terribly surprising when you think about the frontal lobes not maturing until we're about 25. But if there are deficits that are not just from normal development, you could see those kind of behaviors that will persist even after adolescence. It is involved in high levels of risk-taking behavior, reward-seeking, low self-control, and those are kind of behaviors that we normally see in young people. Young people tend to be a little bit more impulsive. They tend to engage in more risk-taking behavior, but especially in males, by the way, male adolescents. But it tends to decline over time as the brain matures. So we tend to see a normal decline in these types of behaviors. But for those people who have cognitive deficits, meaning that there's some type of impairment with the functioning of the frontal lobes, we could see those kind of behaviors continue on past adolescence. All right, so super interesting chapter, a lot of great links in D2L on this, so make sure you watch those. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great